We might meet for like a minute or two after that to see.
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
And then, yeah, we'll make sure to take a break before Q&A.
I kind of wish that Kevin KM was going to be here.
Yeah, me too. I cite his book in my talk a couple times.
I have he sent it to me. I just haven't even had a chance to look at it yet.
It's a tough read. It is not. I mean, I work in this field, and I read it slowly. He really just doesn't use examples. Like, so he doesn't illustrate what he's talking about. He like just makes the abstract point. And
sorry, I missed it.
Oh yeah, Carrie. No, I didn't end up citing her. I changed things up a little bit. I might mention where I had cited her paper, but I'm not actually getting into the details of it. But yeah, that would have been cool. I mean, I know I've met Carrie a couple of times. I think she knows who I am. I mean, we're Facebook friends.
Wow, I'm not even Facebook friends with her.
Yeah, she doesn't use it very much. But yeah, no, she would probably not. Well, I have no idea if she'd like my talk. I know she wouldn't agree with it, but no one does. That's why I'm giving it here. Well, Kevin does. That's why it would have been nice to have like one person in the audience.
Is it too late to DM him on Twitter and invite him?
No, go ahead. I mean, he knows about it. I've tweeted about it. But yeah, I thought about it, but I'm like, no, I can't. I can't. If you want to, yeah, great. Love to have.
I'll at least guilt him a little bit.
Okay. I'll be right back. I'm gonna just step away for 1 second before we.
There was one more boyo who needed to make an appearance today.
Okay. Yes. Lilliput's too curled up in a bed. She has beds all over the house, so she's a little too comfortable for me to drag her up here right now. But yeah, that one is Eddie.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
He's sleeping outside. He's like half asleep right now.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I will be right back.
Wonderful. Yeah, if people want to use the next 4 minutes or so to grab some water or make another last trip to the restroom real quick, whatever, grab a cup of coffee, feel free to do that. Otherwise, we will start in a couple minutes.
I think I missed it. What's the Halloween talk situation? Is that like a go or in the works?
You want to go ahead?
Halloween Conctweeto.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the works, thinking of Halloween, doing maybe a 2-day thing with some philosophy D&D AMAs. That's a lot of letters. We were talking about doing some philosophy and film, philosophy and horror, philosophy, sci-fi, philosophy, fantasy stuff, all things philosophy and spooky. So we'll have a call for, well, first of all, I guess, for anyone who wants to be involved in planning or have ideas for sessions or anything like that, you can go to the Cogtweeto website /get-involved, or you'll see it with some scrolling, and let us know you want to be involved, and we can have you as part of the process. But I imagine we'll have a call up within the next couple of weeks for all things spooky and philosophy-y and weird.
Hug weirdo.
Hug weirdo.
Special edition. Originally we were like, I think it was just like weird takes, but now I'm like very excited about like we could even have like spooky metaphysics.
Some hauntology. I still want to hear like which, because I haven't thought about it, but I feel like there are people who have like the implications of different ontologies on the existence of ghosts and spirits and spooky things. Like that's interesting. Like, could there be ghosts if you are a reductive physicalist? I feel like no, but also
No,
I don't know
definitely
what
not.
that means. No,
No.
hard no.
Hard no. I mean, but so technically, physicalism. You could believe in ghosts if you're a reductive physicalist about human minds, right? So hold on a second. Lilput, no, we don't do that anymore. We
What
don't
if
do
there
that.
were ghosts, but it was like just cats? Or like just dogs that were
I was
ghosts?
thinking, okay, what if we qualify that it's only
Yeah.
sensitive souled creatures that have ghosts?
Right. No, I mean, I think no, that's not right, Mason. But you'll see why. But no, so I mean, technically, reductive physicalism is about is generally understood as a thesis about the mind. But you could, I mean, if you just mean like sort of methodological naturalism, or a reductive version of thereof, then uh, then you can't. No, because no, it's just, so on, I guess on Jackson's Jackson's the person who's I most associate with like having given a definition of metaphysical naturalism. And he says basically, if you have a physical copy of the world, then you have a complete copy of the world. That's his definition. So I guess, yeah. So Mason, I guess on Jackson's definition, you'd be right. On my way of thinking about things, that wouldn't work. Yeah, I don't really. Right. I guess that's the thing about my version. I don't care what physicists say. I think there are multiple levels of generality that count as physical, and I don't. I think the sense in the level that I'm concerned about is so far removed from the most fundamental physical level that I don't really care what the most fundamental physical level amounts to.
Well, before you get too far
Yeah.
into this, maybe we can give you a formal introduction.
Oh yeah, sure. Enough people have shown up.
Yeah, we've got people sort of flooding in now. Awesome. Okay, well, thanks everyone for being here. This is the last and the last talk of the day, and only talk that's happening right now. It's our colloquium session. The way that works is there'll be a talk for about 55 minutes. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll have about an hour for a Q&A. I'm very pleased to welcome Jeremy Probert, who's a doctoral candidate at the University of California, Riverside, to join us today for our colloquium talk. And his hot take involves what he calls the psychophysical identity theory.
Right. So that's yeah, I'm not sure who first came up with that name. It was either JJC Smart or UT Place, one of those Australians. Started calling it that. I don't remember which one though. And so before I get started, you'll have to excuse me a little bit. Like I was saying earlier, my camera on my laptop broke, and my new camera didn't arrive in time, so I'm using a $150 Chromebook that I bought last night. It doesn't have Excel on it installed yet, so you're kind of going to get the budget version of my slides that I can run on Google Slides. Um, so, oh, they changed how I want to share. Okay. Okay. So, can everyone see this right now? I can't see. I no longer see any faces. I didn't realize that would be the case when I was sharing. I thought, let me. This is very weird. I don't like not seeing any faces at all. So I'm gonna try to figure out if I can stop. No, I can't figure it out. This is too complicated.
Now.
But you guys can all see this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So thank you to Jen for that introduction. I guess all of this information is therefore redundant because she just said it. So what does the theory amount to? Basic idea is that mind and brain are identical. So sometimes that's why it's called a psychophysical identity. Psycho, mind, physical, brain, hence identity thesis. It's also called reductive physicalism because another way to put it would be to say that the mind reduces to the brain. I've also seen it said the mind is nothing over and above the brain. Basic idea. There's nothing more to having a mind than having a brain that's operating in the right way. For humans, at least. I mean, there could be other creatures. There could be artificial intelligences that have minds, but in their case, their mind would be nothing more than the, computer chips that perform their mental functions. So more formally, it's mental state M is type identical to physical state P. That type is actually pretty important. Or, another formulation, which is not quite the same thing. Mental property M is type identical to physical property P. So a state, I take to be a basic, this is a Putnam's definition from the Meaning of Meaning, a two-place predicate of a chunk of space at or for a given time. So a mental state just refers to a part of the mind, or as I'll be arguing, a part of the brain at or for a given time. A property is an attribute of that part or of that state. So Fodor is famous for token identity, which is that Donald Davidson's anomalous monism is also a variety of token identity. So token identity is the thesis that every given mental state is also a brain state, but their categories don't correspond. And this isn't what I would consider a real identity thesis. It's not an identity thesis in a way that I think is meaty enough, because it necessarily doesn't involve property identity. Because what it says is a given state is the mental type it is in virtue of some of its properties, and the physical state type that it is in virtue of some other distinct properties. If something was a belief, so to use the hackneyed example that we all know is false at this point, if something is pain and C fiber firings, if it's pain in virtue of some set of properties, like its phenomenal character, and it's C fiber firing in virtue of the matter that makes it up, then pain and C fiber firing, they're not the same property. So those types don't correspond because other things could be pain and C fiber firing could be other things. But when the properties correspond, then it's the same thing. It sort of tracks throughout. If the same thing, very same thing, makes a bit of brain matter pain that makes it C fiber firing, then the two are going to map on. Then the two categories will map onto each other. So that's the thesis, or a version of that thesis is what I want to defend. And this really draws a lot of antipathy. I have my sociological hypotheses as to why, but I personally find it puzzling, especially among people who otherwise claim to be naturalists and who claim to really value sort of empirical data being done in cognitive psychology. And it seems obviously right. If you're going to be a naturalist, I think this is the only way to be a naturalist. So I'm going to cover a couple of things. First, I'll cover the main argument that reductive physicalists deploy against what's called non-reductive physicalism, which is what most functionalists are. Functionalism is technically compatible with either reductive or non-reductive physicalism. So that's not new. That's an argument that's made been made in several places by several different people. I just want to cover it to sort of motivate the view. I want to respond to various versions of the multiple realizability challenge, because this is the main issue that non-reductive functionalists charge us reductive people with. That I'll explain what it amounts to soon, but I don't think it gets them what they want, and so I'll say why, and then I'll talk a bit about what I mean by identity. And I think part of the problem I think both of these issues are sort of misunderstood by the naturalist opponents of reductive physicalism. I think they assume that multiple realizability has to be one thing, and it's actually not that thing. And I think they assume that identity has to work a certain way, and it doesn't work that way. And if their assumptions were right, then reductive physicalism would in fact be a non-starter. But it's because those assumptions are wrong that it's the right view. So I'm not going to cover, unless we have extra time, which I do not think I will in the talk. I have thoughts about these. I'm happy to chat about them in the Q&A for a bit if we have time. But I'm not going to cover in this talk arguments against reductive physicalism issuing from non-physicalists. So these are arguments that some people would argue that the mind is essentially normative, that it is sort of guided by the norms of rationality, even though they are not physically implemented. That is an objection to physicalism, because if the norms aren't physically implemented, how could a physicalist explain how the mind is guided by them? Phenomenality, the what it's likeness. This is a big, this one, I think, eventually I'll have to deal with at some point in my career if I want to keep pursuing this line of thinking. The charge that brain stuff can't explain why it is that we have qualitative experiences, why we enter into states that can be characterized as what it's like to be in a certain way. This is a really tough and deep challenge. But I'm not addressing it here. And one of the reasons I'm not addressing either of these issues is they apply to non-reductive physicalism just as much as they apply to reductive physicalism. So I'm not in any worse shape than the person I'm really sort of arguing with in this talk, if these objections work. So functionalism is just the idea that what it is to be a mental state type is defined in terms of what it does. And there are several ways to cast this out. I'll put that up in a sec. My preferred way is in terms of the causal role of a mental state. That is to say, what the effects are, what is downstream of that mental state or process, and what its inputs are, what input output, what other states it's related to, how it gets created, and what happens when you have it. And I'll give some examples of this throughout the talk. This formulation, like I said, is neutral between reductive and non-reductive functionalism. Non-reductive functionalism says that these states are other than brain states. There's something a little bit above and beyond brain states. Reductive functionalism just says, well, the things that have those properties, the things that have those effects within the mind and in the world, those are brain states. So the main argument against non-reductive functionalism is called the causal exclusion argument. It comes, I think, it was originally deployed in a different context by Pargetter and Jackson in 1982. It was most famously applied in the context of debates about reductive versus non-reductive physicalism by the late, great Jaegwon Kim. It was the dissertation advisor of Philosophy Twitter's own Kevin Morris, who also deploys it a slightly more nuanced version in his recent book. What does it amount to? Well, it's just basically, so it's a conjunction of a couple of claims. I'll put it in logical form here. So if physicalism is true, then for any event E, there is a sufficient physical cause, PE. Once a sufficient cause is identified, of any event is identified, there is no quote unquote causal work left to be assigned to anything else. Once something does all of the causal work, there's nothing else is doing any work. So you can think of this as if I'm, pushing a car to get it moving, and I'm pushing hard enough for the car to move at 5 miles an hour, and the car is moving at 5 miles an hour, then no one else is really pushing the car. If someone else were pushing the car, it would be going faster than the force that I am putting on the car alone would make it go. So once the sufficient cause is identified, there's no causal work left to be assigned to anything else. Mental events are events. And for any mental event, that means for any mental event E, there is sufficient physical cause. For many mental event E, there is no causal work left to be done by anything other than its physical cause. So if the physical, this leads to a dilemma. If the physical cause is the entire cause, then either the mental cause of a mental event is the same thing as the physical cause, in which case they have the same physical powers and there's no problem. This is the reductive position. Or the mental cause is not the physical cause, but in that case, the mental cause is epiphenomenal. It's just not doing anything, because the physical cause is doing all the work. So what does it mean for the mental cause not to be the physical cause? Well, most non-reductive physicalists endorse something like what's called role functionalism. Role functionalism is a mental state, is a higher order state of having some physical state play a specific functional role. So take a belief and a desire, a pair of a belief and a desire. Let's use the example everyone uses. I want beer. I have a belief that there is beer in my fridge. There actually is beer in my fridge for once. I usually almost always out, but today I have some. And I'm happy about this. And so given that I want beer and at that moment, and I believe there's some in my fridge, then the belief and the desire jointly cause me to get up and go to my fridge. Or if you want to be really formal about it, they cause me to form an intention to go to my fridge, which then causes me to go to my fridge. Now, what role functionalism is saying is the belief isn't the brain, the neural stuff that is really, sending signals out to my motor cortex, my motor system, which is then sending signals throughout my peripheral nervous system, which is then causing my muscles to contract and expand. And contraction and expansion of these muscles in concert is what constitutes my action, my getting up and going to the fridge. The reductive physicalist says the belief and desire just are those the neural things that are doing that. And the role functionalist, on the other hand, says belief and desire are higher order states, the state of having some physical state play a specific function, having some physical state do that. If you have some physical state do that, that physical state is called the realizer of the mental state, but it's not the same as the mental state. It's the mental state is the state of having a realizer. So this is true that the mental state is epiphenomenal because the neural state is doing all of the causal work. Some people think token identity solves this problem, but really token identity is just another version of role functionalism. Token identity resists identification of mental and physical properties. Thus, a mental property becomes the higher order property of having some physical state possess a functional role property. So here you'd say my brain, some part of my brain has the property of causing me to go to the fridge and get beer. That's a functional role property. It's the property of causing certain effects. The mental property, the belief and the desire, are the higher order properties of having some physical states do that. So then mental properties are epiphenomenal, even if mental states aren't, because it's the physical properties that are doing all of the work. And this is, so you can embrace this conclusion. That is a view that is consistent with the causal exclusion argument. You can be a dualist and epiphenomenalist, which Frank Jackson was for a while before he came back to the right side of reductive physicalism, which is that, yeah, okay, so physical stuff is doing all of the causal work, but there's mental stuff, their feelings, their qualitative states, and they just don't do anything. It's technically not a violation of the causal exclusion argument. It's not overdetermination if you have mental states and they just don't do anything, but it really, really seems wrong. Like, what he would have to say is that when you touch a hot stove and you pull your hand away from the stove, you're not actually pulling your hand away from the stove because it feels hot. The stove's feeling hot and you're pulling your hand away from the stove are effects of the same cause. Instead, that's what an epiphenomenal dualist would have to say. So it just seems like the wrong view. And I think I take it that is generally seen by all contenders in this debate, whether physicalist or non-reductive physicalist, as the wrong view. But non-reductive physicalists have an equally powerful, some think more powerful argument against reductive physicalism. That is, it's in a sense, you get both if they come together, because they have the same underlying structure that leads to both causal exclusion and multiple realizability. So multiple realizability, well, there are two versions that I want to discuss and distinguish. What I'll call the basic version comes from Putnam's The Nature of Mental States. And it's the idea that many organisms can be in pain, but not all have the same brain, or as Putnam puts it in his paper, physicochemical state that realizes the pain. So we were having a discussion in the break time earlier about animal minds. And I think that dogs feel pain, but dogs don't have human brains. Their brains aren't quite like ours. So pain is pain. It's not that dog pain is fundamentally a different kind of feeling than human pain. Rather, we both feel pain, but Lilliput's would be felt in a different kind of brain state. Moreover, you can picture an alien species like Martians. David Lewis, in his paper Mad Pain and Martian Pain, suggests that Martians could feel pain that's exactly like ours, from a functional and qualitative perspective, but not have brains at all. Instead, they have systems of hydraulic pumps. And you wouldn't want to deny that that's conceivable and that's possible. So what that means is that pain is multiply realizable in terms of its physical basis. That's why, going back to role functionalism, they call the physical state the realizer. And that's why role functionalism, its advantage is that a belief is having any physical state be the realizer of a certain functional role. And it doesn't matter what the physical state is. And that's good because it seems like a lot of different kinds of organisms and different hypothetical aliens and other planets and possible worlds can have beliefs without having anything like the physical structure in our heads that realize our beliefs. So the non-reductive physicalist replaces the identity relation with this realization relation in a way that allows for multiple realizability. But if it's multiply realizable, how can it be identical to any of its realizers? Well, really, it just can't. It can, and that one can make an argument saying it just can, and respond that way. And people have tried, and it hasn't really persuaded people. So I think that's only part of the picture, which I'll get to later. I think there is a better response, or at least a better. You can. The reductive physicalist has multiple potential responses. And when you put them all together, I think that's when they make the convincing case. There's also a formal version of the multiple realizability thesis. This comes from Fodor's paper on disunity of science as a working hypothesis. So Fodor says if we can reduce theory R to lower level base theory B, then for every natural, quote unquote, natural kind predicate in R, there must be a corresponding quote unquote natural kind predicate in B. But some term T in the higher level theory R exists in humans, dogs, and Martians. Say T is pain. But there's no single predicate in the lower physical theory corresponding. That means T is a disjunction of a bunch of possible realizers. But that can't be right, because then you can't reduce it according to Fodor. To reduce it, he says, you have to have a perfectly corresponding natural kind predicate in the lower theory. So that's how you get water and H2O. Those are perfectly corresponding predicates. All water is H2O. There's a higher theory, of just, pre-theoretic, everyday going substances you see in the world. And then there's a theory of chemicals, and we can reduce the pre-theoretic to the theory of chemicals because the predicate water and the predicate H2O perfectly correspond. There's no brain state equivalent for mental states that corresponds like that, because again, mental states can, in theory, exist in beings that don't even have what we would call brains. So this is admittedly a pretty strong argument, but I think there are several responses. And I think when you put them together, they work. So the first step, these are a couple notes by people who do mechanistic philosophy of science, which is something I'll invoke in more detail in my second and third responses. But Bechtel and Mundell, I think that's supposed to say 97. I don't know why I got that wrong. I swore anyway. So when we talk about mental state types, we talk about them in very broad and abstract terms like pain or a belief or low putt, sorry. But when neuroscientists talk about neural kinds, they talk about them in much more finely grained detail. In fact, some neuroscientists, depending on what branch of neuroscience you're working in, might talk about them in terms of individual neuron differences. Most neuroscientists wouldn't go to that level of detail, but they'll still talk about neural bundles and how much activation there is in a given bundle or a given circuit or something like that. And these are much more finely grained predicates than our psychological predicates, which are very general. So one side of this is that there's a mismatch, and that was Bill Bechtel and Mundell, Jennifer Mundell, I want to say, noted that. On the flip side, Gualtiero, Piccinini, and Carl Craver point out that at some really low level, when you get fine enough with your functions, every functional change results in implies logically a physical change. So every time there's a functional difference, if you're really, really closely examining the input-output relations under a microscope, there's going to be a physical difference that's responsible for that functional difference. Everyone agrees the opposite is true. Everyone agrees that a physical chain, both the non-reductive physicalists rather, and the reductive physicalists at least, all the physicalists agree that if you change the physical makeup of something, then you change its functional structure. But they think you can they don't go both ways. So I think they're onto this response is onto something, but I think there's a better way to put it. I think there are multiple levels of abstraction within functionalism, and we can make principal distinctions between these levels. And that'll explain a lot more than just saying there's a mismatch in terms of abstraction. So how do we do that? So we're going to take a brief detour into varieties of functionalism. And this, by the way, these couple of slides on functionalism are actually, if you really like them, but you hate the rest of the talk, you can peel them off and endorse this version of functionalism without being a reductive physicalist, which I would take as a consolation prize. So all functionalism means mental state type identity conditions are given via what's called the Lewis-Ramsey sentence. A Lewis-Ramsey sentence is simply a sentence that identifies what you're talking about in terms of its relations to the other things you're talking about. The example that Lewis gave is sort of a murder mystery. So where you start reading a murder mystery novel and you don't know anything about the characters. You learn their names, or you could think of it as the game Clue. There's Colonel Mustard, and Colonel Mustard's the only one I remember. Professor Plum, that's another one. And you don't know anything about them, but you learn that how they're related and what sort of things they do. And you come to define them in terms of their relations to other characters and other objects in the story. So Lewis, following the early 20th century philosopher Frank Ramsey, says you can define mental state types this way. So state M is the state that's caused by A, B, or C in the presence of, and when it is instantiated in the presence of L, J, or K, causes X, Y, or Z respectively. That's just an example of what the definition of a given variable in a Lewis-Ramsey sentence could look like. And then there would be similar definitions for A, B, C, L, J, K, X, Y, Z. So that's sort of how you formally define a functional role. So Ned Block, who's written some absolutely fantastic stuff that I really use a lot of, defines two kinds of functionalism. One he calls analytic functionalism. He says the candidates for input-outputs, that is the candidates for these variables A through Z, in terms of which we're defining them, are things we already know from a common sense psychology. They're the things we perceive, they're our behavior, and roughly they're the kinds of mental states that are posited by folk psychology: beliefs, desires, emotions, intentions, etc. So here's an example. Object, beer in the fridge. Perceive a beer in the fridge. Form a belief that there is a beer exists in the fridge. And when you form that belief in the presence of a desire for beer, you form an intention to go to the fridge. And then you go to the fridge. So these are sort of causal input-output relations that you could use in an analytic functionalism. And you could see how you might now define the belief that beer in the fridge is the mental state that is caused by perception of beer in the fridge, which in the presence of desire for beer causes the formation of the intention to go to the fridge. That's exactly of the form that I was talking about up here. So this is pretty simple and pretty nice story. And all of the early versions of functionalism looked something like this. But there's also psychofunctionalism. And most functionalists today, reductive or non-reductive, are psychofunctionalists. I think Eric Schwitzgable, my dissertation advisor, and Frank Jackson are the only people around who are defending analytic functionalism. Psychofunctionalism says that candidates for inputs and outputs are those from analytic functionalism, plus any state, process, or property posited by a true empirical psychology. And by a true empirical psychology, I mean something like what it is that, what psychology the discipline will eventually find when it's done or complete, if that's even possible. So a psychofunctional role for the same story, for the same bit might look like this. Beer in the fridge causes an image on the retina, which causes some computations to go on in the early visual processing system, which leads to the orbital frontal cortex, which integrates information from multiple senses and provides a concept and subsumes the objects that you're perceiving under a concept. So you don't just see patterns and shapes and blobs, you see beers, cans of beer. So then once you have the perception of a can of beer, and that's given by this process, you form a hypothesis that there's a beer in the fridge, and your hypothesis checking mechanisms to make sure this belief isn't absurd says, nope, that makes sense. So then you form a belief that there's beer in that hypothesis formation and verification stuff comes from Capgras syndrome. That's where they sort of talk about those mechanisms a lot. Then you form the belief that there's beer in the fridge, which again, in the presence of desire for beer, leads to sort of a goal-directed simulation system where your mind sort of automatically plays out the idea of going to the fridge and getting a beer, and realize you see it gets a little check mark that this behavior would help you achieve your goal of getting a beer. So then you form an intention to go to the fridge. Then this intention sends a signal to the motor system, which forms representations of your body position and make sure that you're not going to fall on your ass. And then once it confirms that you're not going to fall on your ass, it sends those instructions out along your peripheral nervous system to your muscles so that you move in that way. So here, a belief is going to be defined much differently, right? Because its input is now these hypothesis formation and verification mechanisms. That's what A, B, and C are now. And its outputs are now states of goal-directed simulation systems and not intentions themselves. No, Lilliput, we don't do that anymore. I'll explain that later if anyone's really curious, but there's a behavior that I have to stop training her to do that she just really, really wants to do today, even though she hasn't done it like the last month. Lilliput, hey. So there's a problem with analytic functionalism. It doesn't explain stuff very well. I mean, it does explain stuff, but not nearly as well as psychofunctionalism. That's why people generally prefer psychofunctionalism. So this example comes from Jake Quilty-Dunn and Eric Mandelbaum, some of whom you might also know on Philosophy Twitter. Jake's a little more active than Eric these days. When humans are presented with evidence that contradicts a belief that matters to them, something that's sort of central to their identity, instead of revising their belief, they double down on it and dismiss the evidence. This is a really robust phenomenon. It's called cognitive dissonance. So here's an analytics functional story. You get the presentation of evidence that not P. You perceive that, you hear what the other person is saying, or you read it. You have a belief, you already have a belief that P with an antecedent credence level, call it 0.7. And what then happens is your credence increases and your credence in the evidence that you are perceiving decreases. How does that happen? Well, nothing in that story really says how. It just tells you the steps. Now, there may be a possible kind of explanation we can appeal to within the framework of analytic functionalism. And this is something that the original, I forget who the scholars were. It was like in the 50s. Quilty-Dunn and Mandelbaum go over this data a lot. Great detail in their paper that I cite right here. They figured out that maybe the mechanism has to do with affect, that having beliefs one cares about contradicted is uncomfortable. So maybe you could say, you're presented with the evidence, you perceive it, you have your belief, and now you have a negative affect, negative feeling. So you change your credence, you raise your credence in the belief, you lower your credence in the evidence, and by doing so, you remove the negative effect of the negative feeling. So this tells you a bit about the causal story of why you might increase your credence in the belief as opposed to altering your belief. It tells you that affect plays a role in causing you to do this because doing it will remove your negative affect. So it's kind of that's an explanation. I mean, let's not, fine, it's an explanation. But here's a much better explanation. That there's a system called the psychological immune system, which Eric Mandelbaum in a follow-up paper to the one above discusses, which treats threats to beliefs central to one's identity as pathogens. So basically, if you're really believe that you're a good philosopher and you keep getting people keep telling you you're terrible, your psychological immune system will treat you're hearing the possible belief that you're not very good at it as a pathogen to your mind, and it'll attack that pathogen in the way that your actual immune system attacks actual pathogens. So here you get a much stronger story. Presentation of evidence that not P, perception, negative affect. The negative affect now activates the psychological immune system. This psychological immune system has the function of changing the belief credences and the credence and increasing your credence in your antecedent belief, decreasing your credence in the evidence presented, and removing the negative affect. We know that because we've now detailed the system that does that, and now it deactivates once its job is done. So this is a better explanation. Psychofunctionalism is always going to give you a better explanation, a more robust explanation. I could have given different examples. I could have shown you how psychofunctionalism can explain differences in behavior that analytic functionalism can't. So yeah, I'm not going to get into that detail. I got to move on. But psychofunctionalism has more explanatory power, but it also has a problem. So remember that these are theories of what it is to be a mental state. The problem with psychofunctionalism is it makes the necessary conditions for being any kind of mental state so strict that clearly minded beings fail them. I'm going to give you a long block quote here, which is just really perfect. I can't improve on this example. Block says, suppose we meet Martians and find them to be behaviorally indistinguishable from humans. We learn their language, they learn ours. We develop commercial and cultural relations with them. We contribute to their journals and enjoy their movies and vice versa. Then the Martian and human psychologists compare notes, only to find that the underlying psychological mechanisms in Martians are very different. Skipping a bit. So we both make the same inferences. But suppose that one species, say humans, makes the inferences by representing in their minds all of the premises and conclusions in English, and also representing the inference rules in English. The Martians, on the other hand, their minds have a procedure for translating English into an artificial language, quote unquote, whose sentences wear their logical forms on their faces. Basically, it's a formal language. And so this makes the inference rules much simpler to represent in your mind, and inference is much simpler to compute, but you have the added cost of translating from English into this formal language when you receive premises, and translating back when you want to state the conclusion. Now, this difference is not enough to say that the Martians can't make inferences, don't have beliefs, don't have minds. But that's exactly what psychofunctionalism technically claims. Because psychofunctionalism has a sort of it's Ramsey's sentence that defines what it is to make an inference. In one case, the input and output are to translation systems, and in the other case, they're not. It's different inputs and outputs can't be the same thing. So if psychofunctionalism says what it is to be a mental state is to have the process that humans have, because again, psychofunctionalism is using an empirical psychology, and humans are the subject that we study. It says this is what it is to make an inference, then Martians don't make inferences. And this is a problem. It should say the Lewis Ramsey sentence, true of humans would not be true of Martians. Okay. So what I suggest we do, and this is sort of something, that again, that functionalists can do on their own, is combine these. So you combine them. What I want to do is use Bloch's conception of core and total realizers minus the neural. So for Bloch, we say the fusiform face gyrus is quote unquote responsible for face perception, but alone it's responsible for nothing. You take the fusiform face gyrus out of your brain, put it in a jar, it's not going to do it. Even if you were sending the right electrical currents through it, wouldn't do anything. So really, face perception is underwritten by a great many neural systems operating in tandem. But what separates the fusiform face gyrus from the rest of them is that it's unique to face perception. All of the other systems involved, like your basic visual system, are involved in other functions. So you now call this thing that's unique to face perception its core neural basis. And the others is total neural basis. So I say, you can, a state with the psychofunctional role of belief is the one that's between hypothesis formation and verification mechanisms on the one hand, and goal-directed simulation systems on the other, is the core realizer of the state that's between perception and intention. And these other mechanisms, like the hypothesis formation verification mechanism, are part of the total realizer of belief. So now you have two levels, an analytic level and a functional. So the analytic functional role of inference is the same. They make the same inferences. You give them the same premises, they'll come up with the same conclusions. The core realizers are different. Total realizers are different, but what this means is, and here's where we get this as an upshot to identity. Analytic functional roles are multiply realizable in terms of their psychofunctionally delineated realizer bases. So you have these two functional levels and a principal distinction between them. And one of them is multiply realizable in terms of the other. That is to say, the multiple realization relation happens between functional levels without even bringing physical stuff into the picture. So take Putnam's argument. Human and pain and dog pain have different realizers. Putnam thinks this proves multiple realizability between functional and physical state types. What it really proves is that an analytic functional role, pain, has different realizers, has different lower level functional realizers. It does not prove that those lower psychofunctional roles themselves have multiple physical realizers. In essence, you can offload all of the multiple realizability to this relation between functional levels. It's compatible with Putnam's argument that for every different neural state type that realizes pain, there's a different functional state type at a low enough functional level. And here, if this is true, if this first little subdot is true, then you have type identity between a functional state type and a neural state type. It's not between the high-level analytic functional role, pain. It's between this really low-level psychofunctional role and a neural state type. But it's a real identity. It's a real type identity. But we got to see: are there neural state types that correspond to these low-level functional types? Just because there can be doesn't mean there are. I'll get back to that in a second. So what about Fodor? Fodor said that for reduction to work, then for every natural kind predicate at the higher level, there must be a corresponding natural kind predicate at the lower level. So if the level to be reduced is the level that includes pain, the game is over, because so many different, even functional things can correspond to pain across species. But my argument is that the reduced level is a more finely grained functional level, this kind of dog pain. But we still don't have a neural predicate that corresponds to this kind of dog pain. This is another objection, a second objection, that that non-reductive functionalists, a second variety of multiple realizability objection that non-reductive physicalists raise against people like me, which is, okay, well, why haven't we found the neural correlates? Why haven't we found the neural correlates for belief or for desire? Well, the answer is that we're looking, the way that Fodor suggested we look is wrong. We don't end up with a one-to-one correspondence of predicates. Rather, a phenomenon at a higher level reduces to a set of entities at a lower level, each with their own function and a specific organization or series of interactions between these parts. Here's an example of how this works. So let's not do the pretend this top level is the psychofunctional role. It's the one that I'm claiming does correspond to a neural state type. But that neural state type is really a bunch of these systems acting in tandem together. It's not one predicate and at the neural level. It's multiple predicates at the neural level. Yet it's a real reduction. Everything that's going on up here is explained by what's going on here. So here are some examples of what I think are some tentatively successful reductions of states. So emotions. This comes in part from my own work, which you can find in philosophy of science. The relevant systems at the neural level are perception or perceptual systems. That's an oversimplification. It's called core affect, which is your ever-present state of how good you're feeling and how hyper or aroused you're feeling. A sort of a categorization system that's involved in perception, like the system that's implicated when you open your eyes and you see computers and tables and chairs instead of shapes and colors. And memory and action simulation. So here's how it works. You have a feeling state. You sort of turn your eyes inward and you categorize your own affective state as anger or fear or something, drawing on contextual clues. If there's a bear chasing you, that's a good reason to think it's fear. If you're yelling at a colleague, that's a good reason to think it's anger. And similar instances. So you draw on those contextual clues and how you've categorized that kind of affective state in the past. The categorization suggests an action, like running the hell away from the bear, which is simulated to test for goal congruence. So you can run through the idea, pun intended, of running away from the bear in your head. And you realize that, if you make it to a tree and climb it, this is going to maybe get you away from the bear. Or if you really actually know anything about bears, you realize that it won't. And what you need to do is sort of back away very slowly. And these are all part of an emotion, according to this view. Another example from Railton's theory of desire. So a perceptual system, the reinforcement learning or reward system, that's the one that's active in the Pavlov rat experiments, but that Railton, following his neuroscience colleague Kent Berridge, calls the liking system, that determines how much you like something. A wanting system that determines how motivated you are to get something at a given time. Again, core affect, the feeling state, sort of a somatosensory monitoring that's monitoring of your own body state, and again, action simulation. So how does this work? So you perceive an object. When you perceive objects, they have sort of an affective value. Something smells really good, or really bad. Rotten food smells really bad, and that's a feeling. So what that feeling represents is your previously recorded value of how much you like something, of what your reward learning system recorded. Okay, so I really like I don't know, steak. I don't eat red meat anymore, but I really like the smell of it. And so I smell steak, and that just smells delicious to me. What that's telling, the reason it smells delicious to me is because in my brain it's associated with positive feelings and enjoyment. If I'm hungry, there's the wanting system combines the information of how much I like something with bodily cues, like if am I hungry, that are received from the somatosensory monitoring systems. If it determines that you do want the thing you like at that moment, then the behavior of obtaining that object sort of enters into your calculations, enters into your, what philosophers will call your practical reasoning, and sends that information to action simulation systems. Wanting also sends information back to the reward learning system to update how much is really liked. And that's desire. That's the basis of a desire. So these are reductions. I mean, the empirical details may be a little off. Theories may get tweaked, or they may get replaced. But in principle, this is how a reduction in neuroscience really works. We take something, we boil it down, we take out all the systems around it, like for a belief, the hypothesis formation and verification systems. And then we look at what systems constitute it. And we're not going to find one system that constitute it. We're going to find a bunch operating in a specific way in tandem. So this is a sort of weak reduction, where the entities, desire, emotion, are reducible to phenomena at a lower level, but the relations between entities are not. So you can reduce a belief and you can reduce a desire, but you can't reduce the relation between a belief and a desire to say that they combine, that, your belief is that X is a good means to achieving your desired end. That relationship can't be reduced. So this means that the predicates at any given level support generalizations that cannot be captured by the vocabulary of lower levels. Nonetheless, it's a real reduction. So this is how I avoid. So you can't explain two people dancing by the relations between their limbs, yet what two people dancing is two people moving their limbs around in relation to each other. But you can't just talk about the limbs, you have to talk about the people. I think that was Alvin Noy's example. My apologies for not citing him. So this means that the psychological predicates are preserved. They're not going to be eliminated, because they're not going to be identical to any predicate at the lower level. You could make a ad hoc predicate of something like all of these systems in combination, but that's ad hoc, and you might as well just use the original predicate desire. Which is to say, reductionism is not a limitativism. So this answers the objection, well, why not? Why, if we're going to go physical, why not look at quarks? Why not look at the most fundamental level of physical things that physicists talk about? Because the answer is because that level isn't going to capture the relevant generalizations. The level of neural systems is. So I am running out of time. We do one more objection, and then I'll stop. I will skip over the identity stuff, the metaphysics of identity. So the psychofunctional level itself seems to contain entities which correspond to neurocognitive systems or circuits. For instance, goal-directed simulation systems. Way back when I introduced psychofunctionalism, that was something I talked about alongside beliefs and desires, not as parts of beliefs and desires. I did talk about it as parts of emotions, but that's, never mind that. So this is an historical artifact. Fodor intentionally, when he first, gave the first psychofunctionalist picture, created a quote unquote level that would contain both empirically posited systems and folk psychological states. So, and that's just been carried onward. The psychofunctional level is a bit of a misnomer. Something like a goal-directed simulation system can be at the same level with respect to some mental states like beliefs and desires, or it can be a proper part of some other mental states like emotions. So the level at which we find the states called beliefs by psychofunctionalists is a hodgepodge with respect to neurocognitive circuits. It has some entities which directly correspond to those circuits, and it has some which are phenomena that are mechanistically reduced to those circuits. So yeah, the rest is getting on to metaphysics of identity and Kripke and Putnam and that stuff. If you're interested in that, I'm happy to talk about it, but I think that is my time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Please join us in giving Jeremy a round of applause for that. So we are on time. If we just want to take like 4 or 5 minutes to take a break, if you need to go to the restroom, grab some water, let your puppies outside, whatever, and we'll reconvene in, let's say, like 104 or 204, sorry, PDT. Yeah, I said 1, I mean 2. Sorry.
Yeah, I couldn't at all see the chat. I had no idea you were giving me time signals. I was just watching my clock. But thank you for doing it.
Oh, I didn't know if you could see the clock or not, or see the chat or not. But like very clearly, like also checking the time like at almost exactly the same time, because it seemed like you were like, giving an uptake, and so like I couldn't tell.
No, it's because I debated in college, so I'm used to watching the clock when I'm talking.
Mm-hmm.
That, and I teach, and I, you know, I have a tendency to go 5 minutes over. It's like my students' least favorite thing about me.
Yeah, I have really bad it's like one of my worst ADHD things is like really bad blindness, and I have just noticed at all. And I had to get a watch that I could like read with a digital face, because like I can read like a traditional analog clock. Like I know how to read clock, but I struggle with it a lot, and I cannot do it fast or like under pressure. And so like I'm just like either not know what time it was, or just like staring at it and trying to like be like, oh, well now my students are thinking about how I can't tell time, and then I like just maybe even later.
Yeah, I'm way worse online, because like in person, I can tell by their level of restlessness, but I don't pick up on that online. So I'm online. I'm just like, guys, I'm gonna go over. I won't go too much over. I'll be recording a lecture. You can leave when the class is done and watch the rest later. Sorry.
It's nice if you've got a recording, they don't miss anything. Okay, well, it is 2:04. So in the spirit of this conversation about punctuality, we can start up the queue. Cassie, do you want to chair this, or do you want me to? Your preference?
Either way.
Okay. I guess I'll do it since I'm talking already. Okay, so if you have questions, please raise your hand. Just in case you don't know or are used to an older version of Zoom where the hand raising feature was under the participants tab, it's now in your bottom sort of main menu on the bottom bar under reactions. So you can raise your hand there. And yeah, we'll start. The first hand I saw was Hayne, so let's start there.
Great, Jeremy, thank you very much. Yeah, that was really interesting. So I've got a quick comment and then a question. So the quick comment is, so I mean, you did mention that you weren't going to be dealing with non-physicalist objections, and I think that's kind of quite wise of you, because as you said, your account is kind of in no worse shape than sort of other physicalist accounts. But it's just like the comment about epiphenomenalism, because I mean, it kind of non-physicalists often, make that distinction between the psychological concept of mind and the phenomenal concept of mind, and it seems like what your talk was really dealing with is kind of the psychological concept of mind, the whole idea of like events that go on that lead to kind of production of behavior and so forth. And yes, under that, it sort of epiphenomenalism about mental state seems, it seems problematic. But so like, I'd say that sort of contemporary dualist philosophers would sort of say that, they're focusing on the phenomenal concept of mind. So in that sense, epiphenomenalism isn't so much of a problem for them, because it's like they can accept that it's there are all these goings on leading to the production of behaviors. Some of them are kind of associated with subjective experiences, and they can still accept that those experiences themselves don't have causal roles in the production of behavior. So that was just kind of a comment. I guess my question is, my question though concerns kind of your account of identity. So a worry I have about about kind of sort of traditional identity theories is that from what I understand, identity relations are kind of sort of not really explanatory, because there's a symmetry in kind of identity relations. When you say that something is identical to something else, there's a symmetry there. So if you're saying that kind of, if you're saying that certain physical systems are sort of identical to the mind, or like the mind is identical to physical systems. Does that sort of collapse into a weird form of panpsychism insofar as like you still, if you're just saying that the relation between the two is identical, then what you've got really is sort of, I guess, a form of like neutral monism, or you can view it in either way. You can view it in like physical terms or in mental terms. So like that's kind of there's my so I've got like a bit of a issue about using sort of identity, and insofar as that like identity relations really don't seem to be explanatory, and I guess then that sort of you're still left with the question then of why we attribute sort of mental states to some physical systems and not to others. If you're just saying that kind of the physical is identical to the mental, then what? How do you explain kind of that the fact that only some physical systems we kind of attribute mental states to?
Good. Great questions. Thank you. Yeah, I think your comment's right. The first thing you said, yeah, I can't. If epiphenomenalism is your way of doing dualism, then nothing you're doing should be threatened by anything that I'm doing. So in terms of your other points on the notion of identity, so I have two thoughts on this. One is simply just to sort of appeal to Donald Davidson, who thinks, identities aren't informative. What's informative are identity statements. What's informative are the way when we describe things under two different descriptions, and by describing them under two different descriptions, attribute what at least seem to be different properties to them, and find out those are the same. That's what's informative. It's the statement. Another, my favorite paper is by one of my favorite philosophers, who unfortunately just this year left our profession. It was very sad to hear that. Bernard Molyneux, formerly at UC Davis, has a wonderful paper called "The Whirlpool of something like the whirlpool of the logic of mind-body identity," and it sort of formalizes this way of showing how identifying things under different descriptions is what makes it informative. If you remind me afterward, I'd be happy to send it to you. I remember I talked to him about it. I read a draft. It was, again, he was a great paper, and I'm very sad that he's no longer doing it. But I get, do what makes you happy. I get that. Plus, now there's a philosophy of mind spot open up at UC Davis. So, so the other thought I have is sometimes I won't say I won't deny identity, but I would say there is another relation that also holds between mind and brain that is not mutually exclusive with identity, and that's the relationship of constitution. And so whereas identity is bidirectional, constitution is unidirectional. And brain constitutes mind, and mind does not constitute brain. And the way in which brain constitutes mind is informative. And this speaks to is a natural segue to your second question, which was something of, so if all mental is physical, then why is not everything physical? Why is panpsychism not true? What separates? Well, it's what I think that's sort of one of the upshots of my view that I would like to emphasize is, well, it's going to be physical properties. There are certain physical properties, certain complexities, certain organizations that give rise to minds, and certain ones that don't. This is something I take from my dissertation chair, Eric Schwitzgebel, who's written on sort of the rights of. I mean, he did AI ethics before AI ethics was a thing. 5 years ago, we did a seminar on the rights of aliens and artificial intelligence. And we watched the Star Trek episode Mismeasure of Man, which is where they debate about whether Lieutenant Commander Data has the rights of a person. And the argument is that he's functionally equivalent to a person. His quote unquote positronic brain is just as complex as our meatwad brain and performs the same functions as our meatwad brain. And so it's those organizational, functional properties about complexity. That's what's going to tell you when physical stuff is the basis for a mind or not.
Thank you.
Did I answer your questions fully?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, great. Awesome. They're great questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to prioritize two question askers who have not asked questions today so far, and then make our way back through the queue. So let's start with Mal.
Hello, can you hear me? I was wondering about something you said fairly early on in the talk, and thanks for it, it was really great, about whether this is the only way to be a naturalist. And I was wondering if I could just press you on that and how you're understanding naturalism, in which case.
Right. So I think the two versions, so this is actually something I'm ripping off of and agreeing with David Chalmers. So Chalmers cites three versions of naturalism: reductive, non-reductive, and sort of Mysterianism, where you just throw up your hands and you say, I don't know. And he says, first of all, Mysterianism just collapses into non-reductive. And non-reductive is beset with these internal inconsistencies that the one that I, emphasize is the causal exclusion problem. But if you I've been working my way through Kevin Morris's, you will know him on Twitter as Bayou Philosophy, his book, Physicalism Deconstructed. And one of his basic theme is that the relations, these alternate relations, like supervenience and and realizing and grounding, they're not, there's no real coherent way to cash them out other than being other words for identity. If realization is the one you're interested in, then Tom Polger and Lawrence Shapiro also have some great work on that, some of which I've read and some of which is high in my queue. But yeah, the idea is simply that these non-reductive, it's a process of elimination a bit. It's sort of like, it's what Fodor would call the only game in town argument. That once we go through all the possible relations between mind and brain that limit themselves to physicalism and aren't identity, then we just they all fall one after another. They fall for some reason. So Kevin about supervenience, he argues, look, it's either it's identity or it's mysterious, and you're just saying they're bare properties that mean some physical thing underlies some mental thing. But you're not going to give the explanation of why the mental supervenes on the physical in physical terms, and thereby you violated physicalism. So you either go with identity or you drop physicalism. And Kevin's book is really great about showing how you could keep trying out different relations and this same exact issue keeps coming up. You either have to make it identity or you have to get rid of physicalism. And maybe getting rid of physicalism is your answer. But that's sort of what I'm saying. If you're going to be physicalist, you have to be my kind of physicalist. Thank you for that question.
Thanks for the answer.
Okay, next is Dan.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, Jen, you should.
Yeah, one of you should.
Jen is upstairs from me. Okay, one sec.
Did not think about that.
It worked
I-
earlier. Here we go.
Hi, what am I doing? Am I just hunting down here? Hi, so yeah, thanks very much for the talk. So I was wondering about something that I take you to have said something about, but what you said, I was just asking if you could clarify a little more. So you say that there's an identity between these kind of lower level psychofunctional states and neural states. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about why a sort of multiple realizability argument doesn't recur there. Why isn't it the case that when you have this more fine-grained psychofunctional description, someone can still turn around and say, well, give me the most fine-grained description that you like. I hypothesize that this very fine-grained functional description could be realized in terms of silicon chips or a massive system of water pipes or whatever. And if you have that over again, then why don't the same problems that you're worried about with functionalism reoccur just at this more fine-grained level?
It absolutely can. And this is the part of my talk I didn't quite get to. So maybe just for a couple minutes, I'll try to go over it very quickly. The answer is, the answer is contingent. The identity is contingent and relative to species or even subsets of species. And that it can be a different physical, the same, even at that low level, the same functional thing can be different, differently realized in a different kind of organism. Where did my slides go? Where are my slides?
Sorry for the leaf blower.
No, I got the Pixies reference there. Okay, that makes me a little sad. So the psychofunctional level, okay. Yep. Next slide. So yeah, that's your objection, right? And I think to get around this, you have to give up necessary identity. And a lot of people really don't like to do that because they really think Kripke and Putnam showed that identities have to be necessary. And I don't think that's quite right. And I've had a lot of arguments with this point about Michael Nelson, and he still doesn't like the way I have it. And I may not make it any better by the time I turn in my dissertation, but it's something I'm worried. So my thinking goes something like this. Putnam's twin Earth experiment is assumed to show that if the word water on twin Earth refers to XYZ, then twin Earthers do not have our concept of water, even if it has all the same superficial properties, because water is something like a rigid designator. Natural kind terms aren't technically rigid designators. Scott Soames has a great book, sort of a couple chapters in a book showing why that I think are right. So our word water is something like a rigid designator. It designates H2O in all possible worlds. But Kripke and Putnam's real aim wasn't to destroy contingent identity completely. It was to dislodge descriptive theories of meaning for certain kinds of terms. So there's this dislodging the descriptive theory of meaning that a set of superficial properties was the meaning of water. Because Kripke pointed out that no set of superficial properties can really be necessary for being a person or being a member of a natural kind. Aristotle could never have done any of the acts we attribute to him, yet he'd still be Aristotle. Putnam pointed out that the description is insufficient. That's what the twin Earth thought experiment shows. Something has the same descriptive properties, but was not water. Or they do not deny that descriptive terms exist. So Joe Biden picks out Joe Biden in all possible worlds. That's rigid designator. The current president of the US does not. It could have been Bernie Sanders. But it is Joe Biden. They're one and the same. The current president of the US and Joe Biden are contingently identical. Or technically, as Michael tries to force me to say, the statement, the current president of the United States is identical to Joe Biden, is contingently true. So Kripke saying that, no, you can't understand these natural kinds as descriptions, but functional roles are descriptions. That just by definition, they say a functional role is the state that is dot 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 dot, dot etc. So different physical entities can meet these descriptions in different possible worlds, or even in different species in the actual universe. If functionalism is true, then these functional descriptions are the definitions of mental state terms. Now, this means they don't work like natural kinds work, according to Kripke and Putnam. Shoemaker says, so what? And if you read into the natural kinds literature that's, popular in philosophy of psychology, philosophy of biology, the homeostatic property cluster review, it seems pretty compatible with functional kinds as well as kinds with an underlying mechanism. The underlying mechanism doesn't have to be the same in all members of a kind. I've written more on this. I'm still working on it. If you want, but really, it simply comes down to the idea that, and Bloch pointed this out in his Troubles with Functionalism paper. He said, look, if functionalism is true, then so-called scientific terms in psychology are different from those in other scientific fields. We don't, maybe quantum mechanics, but I just don't believe in taking quantum mechanics as having implications for anything above quantum mechanics. Two things can be in the same place at once in quantum mechanics. They can't outside of quantum mechanics. But in biology or in chemistry, we don't define our scientific terms in terms via functional roles. If functionalism is true, if psychofunctionalism is true, then in psychology we do. So they're just different, and there's no prohibition on a description. Identities via descriptions still being contingently true. The prohibition is on identities via natural kind terms of a certain sort, or rigid designators being contingently true. So now one twist here is that I could have used just this move to support my whole project. I just don't think that's tenable. I think these various moves are better when you combine them. The less work each single one has to do, the more plausible the story is. So does that answer your question? I mean,
it does. It raises a lot of other questions.
Okay.
But I want to.
Well, I would at some point I would really enjoy continuing that
Sure.
discussion and hearing from you on that, because we don't really have philosophers of language at Riverside. Like, we hire philosophers of language and then they just decide to do other things. Like Michael Nelson was hired from Yale as a metaphysician and philosopher of language, and he decided he wanted to write a book on Kantian agency. Howie Wetstein, hired from Notre Dame as a philosopher of language. Now he does religious experience.
We have like the opposite.
Every time, yeah. Yeah, every time, I remember every time I meet a baby boomer philosopher of language, like when I met Nathan Salmon when I was at UC Santa Barbara for a conference, he's like, oh, how's Howie doing? What's he working on? I haven't heard from him recently. I'm like, that's because he isn't doing philosophy of language anymore. So I would actually really like to follow up on that with you at some point.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Dan. Okay. And maybe we'll see how the discussion goes. Maybe there'll be more development of some of these ideas. So next in the queue is Devin.
Yeah, so thanks. This is, I think, it's a very long clarificatory question. Just to sort
Okay, can you turn your volume up a little bit?
Hold on, I think maybe I was just too far away. Let me just check.
Right on. Yeah, it's better now.
Okay. Yeah, so I was going to say this, I think, is just a very long clarificatory question to see if I sort of understand what your view is. So we had this causal argument, which shows that we have this dilemma where mental states are either identical to physical states or epiphenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
And then you held that the analytic functional states I'd say there's probably similar to sort of the states of common sense psychology are multiply realizable by the psycho-functional states, and then the psychofunctional states are identical to physical states.
Right.
So the clarificatory question is, do you think that given that it would seem that the analytic, functional, or commonsensical psychological states are not identical to physical states because they're multiply realizable. So do you think those are epiphenomenal? I wasn't.
No, I mean, so what I would say there, I would lean more on the response that I just gave to Dan. I would say that it's really the identity that they have to their realizers is very contingent and very varying. Okay. And it's much more varying. But so actually, okay, so this is going to get a little more technical.
Okay.
I don't posit analytic functional states in my view.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of torn between two ways to go here, and I haven't decided. On the one hand, I posit, sometimes I want to posit analytic functional role properties. And I just say that property is attributable to a set of psychofunctional stuff that's identical to brain stuff.
Right.
And there's no problem there. Then I don't have to talk about what the states are, what analytic functional states are, because I'm not talking about analytic functional states.
Right.
The other way I sometimes want to go is I want to make analytic functional states dispositional states. So sometimes I like to distinguish between a belief and believing. And the belief is the psychofunctional thing. But believing is when you have something or other realizing the analytic functional role. Now, dispositions, there's no problem with there being causally inert or multiply realizable. There's no problem with dispositions being defined as higher order role properties. That's exactly what Pryor, Pargetter, and Jackson do, as well as Brian McLaughlin. And sort of that's why I think the main, Frank Jackson is still occasionally writing papers defending analytic functionalism, but the main defender of analytic functionalism, in my view, is Eric Schwitzgebel, who calls it dispositionalism. It's not Riley dispositionalism because he's not understanding dispositions to be predicates without properties. But if we just think of the analytic functional roles as dispositions, then again, it's those, no, they're not identical with anything else. They're dispositions. They don't have realizers. They have causal bases. Dispositions aren't identical with their causal bases. That's okay. So I sort of go back and forth between those two. I introduce, and this is something I'm working through as I'm editing this particular chapter of my dissertation right now to submit. I introduce it via analytic functional states because it's easier for people to latch on that way. But I really want the idea of an analytic functional state to drop out of the picture in favor of either an analytic functional role property or disposition. And again, I haven't decided which yet.
Do you think the analytical functional role properties or dispositions are explanatory?
They're not. Yes and no. They're not explanatory in the same way as the psychofunctional states. They don't pick out. They don't themselves pick out a cause.
Okay.
But they are generalizations subsuming. Like the dormitive virtue.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually not that bad. It tells you, with the what I'm talking about, that Moliere's joke. Well, identifying a pill as having a dormitive virtue is actually pretty helpful. It tells you which pill to take out of in your medicine cabinet when you want to fall asleep.
Yeah.
Number two, as Brian McLaughlin said, they even play a role in causal explanations. They just don't play the role of being the cause. What they are, they're sort of these linguistic guides to what the cause is. They're like signposts on the road to finding the cause.
Okay, but you presumably would think that, I assume probably our common sense psychological notions are sort of the analytic functional properties and states. So when I say something like, using my common sense notion of belief, that his belief caused him to do so and so, like strictly speaking, that's not correct. It's the sort of common sense causal explanations we give using our common sense psychology.
Well, yeah, so when you're talking about the belief, I think you're talking about the psychofunctional state, but you can still phrase it in exactly the way that you would in common sense.
Okay.
I do have, I didn't get to talk about this, I do have a sort of slight worry about really tightly identifying analytic functionalism with purely common sense terms, because it seems like there are other terms at the level of common sense terms which aren't part of them. So what if, Tamar Gendler's A-leaf, that seems to belong up there with belief and desire and not down with the neurocircuits? Or like also common sense term seems to be a shifting boundary. So today, I would say at least among, people in pursuing a graduate degree, biases are part of our common sense psychology as a causal term. But they weren't several decades ago. But so I have these sort of reservations on really making it a tight link between this sort of, what I really want to say, and I didn't say this yet, is they're person level terms, as opposed to subpersonal. But I didn't want to bring, that distinction opens up a whole nother can of worms that I didn't want to bring into the picture. Actually, it opens up two distinct cans of worms, one in moral psychology and one in philosophy of cognitive science. So yeah, really what I want to say is personal level, not common sense, but they're close enough.
Thanks.
But thank you for the question. That was helpful and definitely made me realize I need to be more clear on that in the chapter I'm about to turn in. And eventually I need to pick which one of those two ways I want to go.
Okay, Luke, you want to jump in?
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I had a question very similar to Dan's. So I sort of wanted to ask about your response you gave to that. So I guess first of all, just to clarify what you take your position to be. So you gave this example about Biden is the current president.
Right.
There's identity there in that there's only one human dude. But there's not identity in the sense of properties. I think, that argument does actually show that the property of being Joe Biden and the property of being the current president are two distinct properties, as evidenced by the fact that they're not necessarily connected.
Good, yeah.
So it seems like if that's your model, the property of being brain state, ABC squared, whatever fine-grained description we give, and the property of being any mental state, again, fine-grained or coarse-grained, are going to be two distinct properties. One is a functional property, the other is a physiological property, and contingently in humans, the physiological property realizes the mental property, or fits the description and so counts as being the mental property. Is that, have I correctly understood that there is a degree of non-reductiveness there?
Well, there's a tension there that you're correct about, and I'm going to bungle how I respond to it a little bit.
Please go ahead.
It's the point I want to, but this is something that Lewis and Frank Jackson are very concerned with, and because they what they want to do is they want to distinguish between sort of the mental state and the property of being in the mental state. Right. So the mental state and I'm having trouble connecting this to your question a little bit. but I think that there's some connection here. So yeah, so here's an example that I think Frank Jackson gives in one of his papers. That's an analogy, and let me know if this speaks to your concern. And if it doesn't, I want to think more, because I think you're raising something very legitimate. So the red, so you have red. Suppose you have red socks. There's the redness of your socks, and then there's the property of your socks being red. Right. The redness is dye. It's just dye at a certain.
Clarify the second item. The property of being red.
Yeah, I think that's how he puts it. No, okay. So let me actually switch that up. That's one of two examples he gives. Maybe the other one's a little easier. So he talks about things that are 6 feet tall and the property of being 6 feet tall. Okay. So things that are 6 feet tall aren't necessarily 6 feet tall. But the property of being 6 feet tall is that's cross world. That's necessarily the same property across worlds. And what he wants to say is that the mental physical identity is more like the first one. You know, this physical state's being this mental state is like you're being 6 feet tall. It's not like you're having the property of being 6 feet tall. So what he says is that means, and he acknowledges what this means is that mental states aren't essentially the kind of mental state that they are. Your brain state is essentially a brain state. It's not essentially pain. It's only pain because of its context and the way it relates to other things. It could have been not pain. So yeah, the idea is that physical states, your brain stuff or silicon chips or whatever, they only have the property of being this kind of mental state contingently. And it's true that the property of being this kind of mental state is not the same thing as the property of being this kind of physical state. But yeah, so that makes it so, but it's not that, but being this mental state isn't anything above and beyond being this physical state.
Certainly. And so I guess I just to clarify, so this is very close to David Lewis's position.
Yeah. So my position is really close to Lewis's. What I do is I add the middle psychofunctional level. And I think this actually helps Lewis out a lot. So one area that I'm interested in, so I mentioned my advisor, Eric Schwitzgable, a couple of times now. So Eric has a paper called Mad Belief, in which he argues you can't have belief without any of the analytic functional role properties of belief. Lewis, on the other hand, obviously says you can have pain without any of the analytic functional role properties of pain, as long as you have the state that is the physical state that is pain in typical members of that species. And I see this as just sort of a stalemate of intuitions. And for me, it's the psychofunctional, adding the psychofunctional level is sort of what adjudicates which way you want to go. So I'll use belief instead of pain. Is the brain state that is that belief in everyone else in your species, is it realizing the psychofunctional role or not? If it's got the psychofunctional role property, then the reason you're not manifesting the analytic functional role is not the belief. It's the stuff around the belief. And therefore, that would be mad belief. But if it isn't doing the functional stuff that's almost simply a consequence of its intrinsic properties and its immediate surroundings, then it's not a belief at all.
I see. So you're trying to agree with Schwitzgable 50% and agree with Lewis 50% on this particular issue, and you're doing that by saying something different about the psychofunctional properties and about the analytic functional properties.
Yeah.
I see. Thanks.
I mean, a lot of what I want to do is I see at least some merit in virtually every view in the field, and I want to take something from them and combine it. So, I think the psychofunctionalists like, Eric Mandelbaum, Jake Quilty Dunn, Mason here, I think they're onto a real project and they're doing interesting stuff. And I want that to be reflected in my view. I think Lewis is doing some really interesting stuff, and I want that to be integrated with the stuff the psychofunctionalists are doing. And then, another person my view is very close to is Kim. But I think the difference between Kim and me is mainly that I think the analytic functional role properties are real properties, and he thinks they're predicates without properties. So, yeah, I'm trying to take a lot from all these people, but I realize, your question makes me realize I have to further think through exactly how I want to understand mental physical property identity, given the contingent nature of mental properties applying to physical things.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
So is your question. Thank you.
Speaking of Mason, you want to jump in?
Hi, can you hear me? Hi. Yeah, thanks for the talk, Jeremy. This is maybe going to be a kind of a goofy question. It's circling around some of the same issues that Dan and Luke were touching on. But I guess I wonder how you would react to someone who took your talk this way, which is, they liked a lot of what you said. And then we got to this thing about contingent identity, and they're just too wrapped up in Kripkean dogma or something. And so they're not inclined to go with you on the contingent identity stuff. And so what they say is, a lot of what Jeremy's talk did was it gave us some really interesting psychological accounts of how these higher order properties are realized in humans. And that's all, that's great. That's exactly the sort of thing that non-reductive physicalists are super interested in, super happy to talk about. But because of these modal differences, we have reason to think that the properties are not identical. Now I know you have this contingent identity thing, but why shouldn't I take your talk that way? Right?
Good. So this is something I do think about. And the thing where I agree with the hardcore Kripkean is that I think that there is a necessary connection between the mental state and the functional role. I think that's what it's tracking across worlds. Then what I want to say is that, look, okay, so if you think there's a relation that's not identity between the physical and the mental / functional, you need to tell me what it is and tell me how it works. Because, and I didn't go over them here, and I probably would botch them a bit now, but there are some good arguments about why a non-reductive realization relation doesn't work.
And so this is going to be for causal exclusion type reasons? Is that the idea?
It's one of the reasons, yeah. I mean, so I've read Morris's work on it. I've read Polger's older work, but apparently, so there's also Lawrence Shapiro and Tom Polger have a co-authored, I want to say new, but it's now 5 years old, well on the philosophy, book called the Multiple Realization Book. And there they have a bunch of arguments about why that I need to read about why the realization relation as a non-reductive relation is problematic. So really, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, look, these are obviously co-referential here, right? They're picking out the same bit of space-time, if nothing else. They're picking out the same event, if you understand state to be, in George Ray's terms, a boring event. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through every other possible co-referential relation and knock them out one by one. The one I may be willing to concede is constitution, the Constitution just seems like a variety of identity to me.
Can I follow up just briefly? Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So actually, I have two follow-ups now. But so one is just I agree with you that supervenience is probably a non-starter. So I'd be interested in your, maybe the answer is I have to go read Kevin's book, which I haven't, but I'd be interested in your thoughts in something like Diablo's determinable determinate. Or
good. Yeah, no, I've been thinking about that one a lot. And that's where I think, I have a couple of thoughts there. One, I think Diablo is compatible with reductive physicalism because the square is the rectangle.
So this is going to throw us back on that contingent identity thing.
Right, yeah. But also I think, so that's why I have multiple moves here. Well, the other one I think is you can take so Diablo is predicated on there being this multiple realizability he says, when there's multiple realizability, we should understand it as determinable determinate. I want to offload as much of that multiple realizability as I can between functional levels. That's where I think the determinable determinate stuff comes in. Now, I've been one idea I've been toying with, and this isn't in Kripke, but it is in some Putnam work. Is that what can be necessary so Putnam in 75 has this really interesting passage about, he says it would be a mistake to understand my view of thinking that a natural kind always has a hidden essence. It could have two hidden essences. He thinks jade is a natural kind, unlike Kim, that has two hidden essences. Or he says it could have so many hidden essences that the hidden essence is no longer definitive of the kind. But it's still a natural kind. It's still a physical set of objects. So one thing I think about is, we have this set of physical objects. It's necessarily identified with the mental state, but the properties in virtue of which it's necessarily identified with the mental state are functional. What I'm sort of doing is and this is something Bloch has a footnote about it that I'm still trying to wrap my head around, and it troubles with functionalism. He says the difference between David Lewis and myself is he only talks about functional role properties as things you can predicate of other kinds of things, like neural states. And I think of functional states as states unto themselves. Now, I'm not 100% sure what that really means, but I think I want to go the Lewis way. And I think that doesn't. So maybe something like when you look at the stuff we're talking about from the perspective of neural kinds, they only contingently have these mental properties. When you're looking at it from the perspective of functional kinds, you can actually get a metaphysically necessary set. It's just the properties that make up that make that set what it is. The properties that put members in that set are functional. And you could directly attribute functional properties to physical things. This is very new in my head, and I'm not sure how much I like it, but it seems like there's something really interesting here about just attributing functional properties to physical things and then making that a natural kind of physical, with physical entities as the members of its set. And that seems to be something that Putnam is okay with, even on the sort of pseudo-rigid identity picture of natural kinds. Because like I said, I think there is a rigid there is a sort of metaphysically necessary tracking of mental properties with some level of functional properties. So I need to think this through a little more, but that's sort of the direction that I'm leaning. But thank you for pressing that. Those are, as always, very helpful questions. I get a lot out of our interactions. I hope when I grumble about physicists defining matter, I hope that's not lost. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Dan, you want to jump back in?
Yeah, thanks. So the last series of back and forth responses have been really helpful. I just wanted to I wanted to present a thought about how one might take the dialectic and see whether or not you think it's misconceived. So I guess one way of thinking about like where we are in the dialectic is we've got this view about how there's multiple levels. Well, maybe levels is kind of a loaded term, but there's multiple important things in the vicinity of physical states that we should care about for doing our mental metaphysics. There's the analytic functional state, there's the psychofunctional state, and there's a neural state. And if I'm and I can think that the distinction between those three things is really important, but people who go that far can disagree about what is the right way to conceive of the interlevel or interstate relations. So you're making the case that we should conceive of it as being contingent identity, whereas, well, I guess this is my question. Do you think that someone who's more tempted by functionalism could say, I like a lot of what you've said, and this is echoing a previous comment, but do you think it would be fair to say someone could respond by saying, I like a lot of the ideas about where these different states turn out to be relevant. It's just that I want to think of the relationships between them as being realization relations. And then there's this separate debate that we can have about which kind of relation is more problematic, realization relations or contingent identity relations. And that's a separate big debate that we could have. But there's something that we can get out of the view, which is prior to that big debate. And that's about the importance of identifying these different relations for figuring out, for example, whether or not a given case of abnormal belief is really a case of mad belief or it's something other than belief entirely. Like, is that a virtue of the view that you can pull out independently of this debate about whether we should be accepting contingent identity versus realization relations? Or do you think that the part of the view that says the relevant relations are contingent identity is more deeply intertwined with the rest of the view, that there's not this other stuff that can be pulled out? Sorry, that was a very
No, that was wonderful, and I think I 100% agree with you. I think you can, but I think I think a couple of things. One, like I said, if I can't convince you to be a reductive functionalist, if I can at least convince you to be a non-reductive hybrid functionalist, I'll take that as a consolation prize. I mean, I'm going to submit the hybrid functionalism paper without any stuff on reduction as a journal article, standalone, in addition to being part of my dissertation on my reductive metaphysics. So I totally think you can do that. And I think you're exactly right about, then the argument is, look, what are the various problems that beset these things, that beset these potential relations between them? And I think you might convince me that you could jury rig a sort of weird necessary identity based on the Putnam and Block remarks that I was talking about. That is the least problematic. But I think where I'm putting my money is that on either something like that or just a standard contingent identity relation is gonna beat out the non-reductive realization relation in terms of being least problematic. I mean, that's very much the way I set up my talk. I was like, look, there's these two things. These two things that I'm obsessed with: causal exclusion and multiple realizability. If you can, in terms of those, if you can, I think it's going to be easier to beat multiple realizability from the reductive standpoint than it's going to be to beat causal exclusion from the non-reductive standpoint. I mean, I think, so the attempts I've seen, the best attempt I think is Yablo's to beat the causal exclusion argument. The paper that Mason, do you know that one on determinables and determinants? That is a fantastic paper, by the way. I really, you know, I don't agree with everything in it, but it's just a fantastic, you know, piece of philosophy. Every other attempt is just really easy in my view to knock out. There's the, you know, define causation as counterfactual dependence. That's a non-starter. There are too many things that are obviously non-causation that involve counterfactual dependence, like two things being effects of the same cause, right? Like if you can't distinguish between genuine causation and that, your view isn't getting off the ground. And Barry Lohr says, well, you know, let's take this quantum conception of causation. It's like you can't pull quantum stuff up from the quantum level. There's just too much weird shit going on at the quantum level for you to draw conclusions from it about how macro things behave. So I think these other, you know, chances to, yeah, it's just the Yablo paper, 92, yeah. No, it's just one really wonderful paper. You can barely apply quantum. So that the quantum, yes, that I believe that. I don't know enough about the quantum level, but I find that very plausible. But yeah, I think that's exactly where the debate heads. I established these three, you know, modes of description of phenomena, and I mean, a lot of what I've been working on is just resuscitating analytic functionalism is viable because so many people think it's a non-starter. And, you know, some people are like, but if you have false generalizations from common sense platitudes, it's like, you don't need common sense platitudes. You can empirically find personal level generalizations, and that's still analytic functionalism. Or, you know, some people think it doesn't have any internal structure. It's just, you know, behavior to perception. And no, there's a really rich internal structure of relations among mental states. And actually, one of the things I've recently written for my sections for my dissertation that I'm most proud of is I use a novel reading of David Marr to explain the two senses of information processing and how there's a level of information processing that's sort of abstract. What kind of information are we interested in processing that is Marr's computational level that corresponds to the analytic functional level. So I think there's a lot going for analytic functionalism generally. And yeah, if I can get people to just appreciate these three phenomena, and that the name of the game is figuring out how to put them together, then I'll be pretty darn happy with my work.
Okay, that is helpful. I want to also, though, I want to shout out, I think Karen Bennett's paper on causal exclusion is awesome. I don't know if that's the view that you were saying you didn't like in talking about counterfactuals, but
maybe, I don't know. I haven't read that one. If you could, do you mind, like, I mean, you could either put it in the chat.
Yeah,
or
sure.
You have my email. I would love.
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. No. Wilson. I do need to read more Wilson. Kevin Morris interacts with Wilson a lot in his book. She was obviously on. Okay. Oh shit! Now I'm gonna have a whole nother pile of papers to read. I gotta turn in my chapters, guys. But yeah, I mean, that'd be very helpful. I will look at that. I mean,
well, that seems like a great place to wrap things, because we've hit our hour mark. So please join me in thanking Jeremy again for this really, really interesting talk.
Thank you guys. Those have been fantastic questions. This is my first like hour-long thing. So I was, and full confession, I'm running on about 2.5 hours of sleep. So I'm a little nervous, to be honest.
No,
I'm very happy with how it went, and these questions were great.
Excellent. That's the goal. Awesome. Okay, well, so we're officially wrapping for today. So please feel free to log off if you need to go do other things. I at least will hang out here for at least another hour and maybe longer if people are chatting and having a good time. Otherwise, thanks so much, and hopefully we'll see you in October for Cog Weirdo.
Oh, Cog Weird! I haven't heard about that. I am happy to crack open a beer and hang out, but aforementioned 2.5 hours of sleep, I do not know how long I'll be able to make it once I have even just just a little bit of alcohol. But yeah, thank you guys so much. This was really fun. I feel
and for those watching at home, I'm ending the stream now. So thanks for watching.
Mm-hmm.